Please be seated. This is the third Sunday of Advent. It's often known as Gaudete or Rose Sunday. It's meant to be a Sunday that's about joy. And you know what? We've been waiting in hope for Christmas for, 2 weeks now. This is the Sunday when that excitement is really starting to build. Instead of readings about apocalypse and cataclysm, which we've kind of been getting up until this point, this morning we've heard news, good news, that God is coming to lift up the oppressed and to liberate the captives. We've heard witness that the Messiah is already among us and that the light is shining forth. We were told that God will restore us and that we should rejoice. Yet, despite all of these signs and witnesses, it is sometimes hard to hold on to that Advent hope. Have you heard the news this week? There's still a lot of darkness out there. This week, if you're like me, you will have tuned in daily with anxiety, hearing about rising virus rates and the shrinking capacity of all of our local ICU units. It looks increasingly likely that we will be sheltered in place for Christmas and unable to travel to see our family or gather in our church. More jobs have been lost this week in all of the shutdowns across the Bay Area, and the expiration of unemployment benefits and rent exemptions nears at the close of the month. Even in the political realm, where we had hoped that things would be decided by now, the possibility of upheaval and uncertainty still lingers. And, there is no shortage of finger pointing about why things seem to have gone from bad to worse. But this is also the week when we finally have an approved vaccine. We witnessed photos and videos of the first recipient in the UK, and there's this sense that some sort of restoration really must be coming. It might just be in its infancy, but it's unfolding, even if it's ever so slowly. So we've also spent this week wondering, can we do this correctly? Can we do it right? How will we get the vaccine out to everyone? We've heard about the lists being drawn up about who's first, the most vulnerable and the essential workers, of course, and then also about who might need to wait and how long. We need to get this right, because if we leave people out, then the virus remains and it could return to haunt us. And of course, also the resentment will fester. So, how do we feel this week? Are we joyful? It's kind of a stretch, but are we at least hopeful? Yes, I would say so, but it's complicated. It's like being in two places at once. It's sort of a both and. Have you heard those scripture readings this week? There's a lot of witnessing in there, witnessing to stuff that isn't right, and also witnessing to a hope at the same time. It's a hope that not only is restoration possible, but that restoration is more than just going back to the way that things were. It's a reading full of hope that people have to do it better and that they can. It's a lot of talk about how things should or ought to be, which means, they probably aren't there yet. It's really complicated. That Isaiah reading especially, it's written just for a time like now. This is a passage that has a history, it has something really big that they're right in the middle of, and it has a road map of a better path forward. Now, I have to kind of set it in its context, because what we've lumped together in the Bible as the book of the prophet Isaiah, most biblical scholars agree is probably the work of lots of different writers, One theory says that it's 3 distinct historical periods, far enough apart that they would have been almost like 3 separate generations of writers. What unifies them is a kind of overarching narrative that's focused on the experience of exile for the leaders of the kingdom of Judah. It talks about questions like, why did it happen? What restoration has God planned for God's people? And how should they do it so that they get things right the second time around? Because going back to that first part, they really were messing it up before. The overarching narrative goes something like this. The first part is basically the prophet Isaiah doing what prophets do. He's calling out the kings and the elites of Judah because they are systematically failing in their covenant with God. This first Isaiah's argument is that they have made the accumulation of wealth and power into an idol. They have forsaken God, and they have forsaken their duty to care for the widows, the orphans, the refugees, and the oppressed. It's both a call for change and also a theological explanation for why all of the bad things that are looming on their horizon are coming and are going to happen to them, including a very real threat of invasion. Now, some scholars think that some of this theological explanation is actually a much later generation looking back upon all of these original prophecies, but it works and holds together either way. The second chunk is situated during the exile of the Judean elite class in Babylon. You would expect this to be filled with all of those "I told you so's," but it's actually mostly words of comfort and promises that God's plan is for restoration. It's a section filled with hope. They will be restored to their land, and they will be restored to their covenant relationship with God. The final part is written during the return from the exile. There's a real hope that they can rebuild their kingdom, but it's also really complicated. There's a lot of talk in that third section about getting it right this time that gives you a real sense that they're very much in the middle of it, and they're just now figuring things out. They've discovered that restoration isn't the same thing as just returning to the way things were before the exile. Today's passage really ties all of it back to that fixing all the things that were blamed for causing the exile to begin with. Isaiah tells us that God's intention is nothing short of messianic intervention. There is one who has been anointed. From the top to the bottom, God has a blueprint to remake all of the injustice and suffering and conflict into real justice and fullness of life for all. It says things like, "He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners." And it says, "They shall repair their ruined cities, for I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and wrongdoing." In other words, God thinks that they can do better, and that restoration is not restoration unless the most vulnerable among them can share in all of its joys too. It's a vision worth hoping for, but it's also one that they are clearly struggling with. Now, today, we might recognize this as that complex both and type of moment. It's a kind of hope coupled with frustration that goes with any time when there is great change and great upheaval. I'm guessing that this is how people might have felt as the soldiers began to return from the battlefronts of World War II. They returned to segregated neighborhoods, and many of them didn't have jobs. But they were also the same ones that had fought to end fascism and to liberate those concentration camps. I witnessed it during the 2 years that I watched nearby South Africa, both ebullient as they dismantled apartheid, but they also were struggling a lot with how exactly to enact justice and create a free and fair society. I know most of us will have remembered the elation of living in our first Black presidency, interwoven with the swelling of anger and protest when systematic racism continued to persistently rear its ugly head in the form of police brutality. It's why we need to celebrate Advent and Christmas every single year. God has already come. God has come to show us the way, and yet we can still do so much better. How can we lean into this both and moment that we find ourselves in right now? How can we make a promise fulfilled become the promise that God intends? That's so much more. How can we move forward carrying both our frustration and our hope, our grief as well as our expectation? Really believing that redemption for all that ails human existence is, in fact, breaking forth little bit by little bit. I know it's hard. It's really hard sometimes to remain those Advent people in all of these both and times. Luckily, we have John the Baptist. We are told that he was sent from God to testify to the light. John's both and witness is quite plainly stated. Get ready. The Messiah is here. In other words, you still have work to do, but also the Messiah is among us. He kind of straight up tells us, yet, you know what? Like today, people weren't exactly sure what to make of him. Despite all of John's denials, people then were confused. They thought that maybe he was, in fact, the one. Now, John tells them over and over again, I'm not the Messiah. I'm only a voice in the wilderness. John is a tireless witness, saying again and again, the light already stands among you. It's only you who are not recognizing it. John's not the only one. Mary knew this too. Her day-to-day existence probably seemed as far from a full realization of Isaiah's prophecy as ours feels today. Yet there's a song that she is said to have sung upon finding out that she will be the mother of the Messiah. It's in the Gospel of Luke, and it speaks not of the future, but of God's work of justice and redemption that's already happening now. It's called the Magnificat, and I'm sure you'd recognize it if you heard it. It says things that are not unlike what we heard in our reading from Isaiah today. Mary's song is an amazing proclamation. She speaks about herself. God has done great things for me. It's very personal. Yet, it's not about her. It's about God's justice for all. Mary understands that this justice is not just a kind of leveling, but a true reversal of fortunes. Those whose greed causes pain and suffering are brought down, while their victims are lifted out of suffering and filled with good things. It's an incredible hope. Mary is not longing for a future salvation, but she's feeling its warmth and power and light filling her own body. It's a present and real force that's so strong, it will reshape all of humanity. Mary feels that advent of God's coming to be among us and within herself. She knows more than hope. She's an expectant mother. Mary's song proclaims that redemption really is possible, even if she must wait even more than 9 months. Mary's another uncompromising witness that God's salvation is breaking out among us even now. It can be hard for us to recognize and believe in the signs. This is why we need all of these witnesses to the truth. So, yes, we have witnesses. The Messiah is among us and the light shines. And yet, the same witnesses tell us that we are missing or misinterpreting these signs, and that restoration is not just about going back, it's about something new and that we can do even better. We need those kinds of witnesses like Isaiah and John and Mary to keep our Advent hope alive, to keep us in that expectation that God is among us, reconciliation and redemption are possible, and our salvation is at hand. Where are our Advent witnesses today? Well, have you heard the news this week? With 2021 only a few weeks away, the looking back has actually begun. And while I know that most people agree that 2020 has in fact been the worst year that we can remember, there has also been a lot of witnessing to the light that's taking place too. I heard this week about someone who, in his boredom of being stuck at home, started toying around with 3D printers. He ended up making thousands of face shields that he sent out for free to healthcare workers. We saw this week the first dose of the COVID vaccine go not to someone who's rich and powerful, but to a 91-year-old grandmother. And you know what? We don't even need to turn on the news. We've met all the people who live right next to us as we've been home enough to walk out our front doors and connect, even if it's from a 6-foot distance with our masks on. We've spent our exile learning more about the normal lives around us, and we've cooked for our families, and we've spent time around the dinner table figuring out who has it worse than we do and how we can help. These are just a few of the voices singing out. They're witnesses that refill our expectation, our hope, and our joy as we stay frustrated with all that remains not yet. COVID is definitely our Grinch as we prepare for Christmas 2020. But just like the Who's in Whoville of that Christmas classic, we're discovering that even without all the things that we always thought we needed to make Christmas Christmas, there is still some cause for rejoicing. Maybe we will have to sing from our cars and save the standing in a giant circle together and holding hands while we sing out loud in public for next year. But we find ways to make joy in this time now. If you haven't read that one in a while, I'm going to recommend that you read it this year. It's a good one. And you can even find it on the internet. So, have you heard the news this week? Witnesses say that new heaven and a new earth is expected. Even in this both and moment, we can start to believe that with Christ's advent into the world, God's Messiah is at work among us, waging reconciliation and redemption for all humanity. That's a Christmas worth preparing for and celebrating with joy. Amen.